we are a culture of yang addicts. And we look at things like coffee and caffeine and chocolate and even alcohol as a way of slowing down. It's like all these things that speed us up. And then it's like, okay, now I get to slow down. Oh, like I need to get heavy. And so there really is this kind of yin deficiency in our culture where we don't honor the feminine, the intuitive, the rest, the enjoying having a body, the enjoying being, the enjoying sleep, letting ourselves feel tired, letting ourselves do less than we're physically capable of. And it's at the same time, it's like we know that actually sets you up for pretty much every disease that there is. It's like when we start dipping into our reserves, things start to break.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Savannah Podcast. I feel like I say this every week, but I'm insanely excited for our chat with today's guest. We're going to be learning how to apply Chinese medicine principles to our daily lives. Together, we're going to discover the 5 different branches of Chinese medicine, the mystical powers of each of our internal organs, how to face our yang addiction, I love that, and how to practice the world's simplest Qi Gong move. Before I introduce our guest for today, just a quick reminder to rate me on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you usually listen to the show. Receiving your feedback really makes my day, so take a moment to let me know how I'm doing with an iTunes review. Okay, so with us for our Chinese medicine exploration is Brodie Welch. She's a licensed acupuncturist, board certified herbalist, and Chinese medicine expert. She's the founder of Life in Balance Acupuncture in Corvallis, Oregon, where she's been treating patients since 2003. In addition to her clinical practice, Brodie helps caring, high-achieving women put themselves on their own to-do lists so they can trade stress and burnout for energy and joy and vibrant health. And she's helped thousands of clients improve their digestion, sleep, and mood, and dial in on a regular mind-body practice so they can step into the next version of themselves. Brodie, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you.
I'm really excited to be here, Brett. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, I love this idea of putting ourselves on our own to-do list. That really resonated with me because I'm looking at my to-do list right now and I'm nowhere on it. So I'm very excited about that idea.
What gets scheduled is the stuff that happens. And so a lot of times it's like we have it backwards, that we feel like we have all this stuff to do and those become our priorities. And really, like, our priorities never actually make it onto our calendars. And so it's just one of those things that just like doing the most important things first in the day is get the most important things onto your calendar so that time is preserved and protected.
I love that. Now, we're going to deep dive into a lot of self-care aspects, but all through this lens of Chinese medicine. So before we deep dive into everything, I'd love it if you just give me and the listeners a context for Chinese medicine. Where did it originate? How long has it been around? Just to give us a brief history.
Sure. Well, Chinese medicine, as its name implies, comes from China, but has spread all throughout Asia. And it sort of arm wrestles with Ayurveda as the world's oldest continuously practiced form of medicine. And so I have read that it dates back 5,000 years. Certainly, we can make a case for at least 3,000 years in that our oldest textbooks, like the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine and our oldest herbal compendium book, go back to at least 2,200 years ago. And so we know, of course, oral tradition, that was how things were passed down way before that. So it's the kind of thing where it's at least 3,000 years old. I've heard up to 5,000. I don't know what the evidence is for that. But basically, it is a complete system, like it's its own thought, its own framework, its own paradigm of medicine, of which acupuncture is the sexiest branch that most people are familiar with, but that actually is... I like to think of Chinese medicine as applied philosophy. And that philosophy was originally from people looking out at nature and noticing that change in nature has a pattern, and that because human beings are part of nature and interconnected with it, that the same sorts of changes that we see with the seasons and the cycles of day and night and the cycles of life are existing within us as well. And so really you can apply Chinese medicine theory to your everyday life by just looking at yourself and your life in that context. So we can think about the energetics of yin and yang and of everything coming from Qi, which is roughly equivalent to prana, and we can use that to tap into points on the body, as in acupuncture, but we can also regulate yin and yang of the different organ systems through herbal medicine, through lifestyle and diet, through exercise, which did not refer to like pumping iron at the gym, but referred to really like this energy yoga known as Qi Gong, working with the energy flow, as well as body work, being able to work with the meridians and the points with your hands. Some people would include meditation and even feng shui as branches of the medicine, because they are certainly all part of the mix. And so really Chinese medicine refers to the application of this unifying theory to create health and really beyond health. It's the original sort of mind, body, spirit medicine all rolled into one, that really it's about living your destiny, being the person that you were born to be.
So much of what you're saying to me sounds so similar to Ayurveda, or so familiar in so many ways.
Yeah, and they're really like, I mean, in terms of like Vata Pitta Kapha being derived from the various elements, and in Ayurveda the elements include air and ether, as well as water and earth and fire. And in Chinese medicine the elements are a little different. We instead of air and ether, we think about the wood element, or a tree, as like, so wind goes through the trees, but the wood element is this upward outward energy. And instead of ether, we actually have an element of metal, in addition to water and fire and earth. And so we think about constitution, right? So like what Chinese medicine and Ayurveda have in common. So there's this notion of prakriti, or constitutional, your original nature in Ayurveda. And in Chinese medicine, we think about the same thing. Everybody's kind of got a different set of cards that were dealt at birth. And that's sort of our genetic and our biological, as well as our personality seeds that we can basically, that it's our job to try to maximize. And that certainly as we grow up, that certain ways of being are encouraged that maybe take us out of balance. Maybe they help us out, but basically that there's ways that we can go out of balance. And really the principle is that we're this interconnected ecosystem, and that all parts relate, and everything that we do in life is going to have either a medicinal, a neutral, or a not so beneficial effect on our lives. And so understanding who we are, understanding our constitution, understanding the different organ systems and what they're about, we can really start to make more medicinal choices.
So just to echo back to make sure I understood correctly, and hopefully so it's helpful for people listening, it's just like in Ayurveda we have our prakriti, it's the same in Chinese medicine. It's this idea that we're all made up of these different elements. It's just the elements are slightly different. One of the things I'm most excited to talk to you about is the different 5 branches, I think you called it, of Chinese medicine, because I think you said acupuncture is the sexiest, right? So people are familiar and know acupuncture, but I was really intrigued when you started talking about all these different branches. Before we dive in and have that conversation, do you think there's any really important terms that you want to define for me and the listeners, just so we're on the same page? For example, I heard you mention Qi earlier, which I think for us in the yoga community, that's like prana, right? The energy life force.
Yeah, so we can make Qi and prana pretty equivalent. But it's also kind of like Qi has a yin and a yang side, and so those are really the 2 subdivisions that I'd like to get into initially. So really, and maybe this is going into a little Taoist cosmology before we even start off. So that from nothing came something, right? So in the beginning there was the void, and then there was like unity. So we go from 0 to 1, and then we go from the 1 comes the 2. And so that's the first division. So as soon as you go from a world of unity to a world of duality, which is the world that we live in, that first basic subdivision of all that is, we can think about yin and yang as those 2 archetypal forces that balance each other out, that are necessary for each other's existence, because you can't have black without white, you can't have up without down, you can't have inside without outside, etc. You can't have hot without cold. So really, as we're thinking about the qualities of our world, from that we go from the 1 to the 2, and then from the 2 to the 3 is that you can't have these things without an interaction between them. And so it's yin and yang. And if you think about the yin yang symbol, which is actually called the Taiji symbol, that it implies this movement, it's not just two black and white rectangles side by side. It's like it's this curvy shape that implies constant movement. So that movement between yin and yang, of yin changing into yang and yang changing into yin, which happens at the extremes, incidentally, is the movement of Qi, the transformation of Qi. So one definition of Qi that I really like is matter on the verge of becoming energy and energy on the verge of becoming matter. So it's that which is alive and dynamic in the world.
This is really interesting because I'm very passionate and I love and teach tantric philosophy, and it sounds very similar, like this idea of yin and yang. It's sort of like Shiva and Shakti, and when the Big Bang happened, Shiva splits away from Shakti, and from nothing, the universe and all things are created. But what's unique here that I'm hearing is that it's not just the 0 to 1, but then what you're talking about now, from 1 to 2, and how this transformation happens in the extreme.
So just like that, the darkest part of the night gives birth to the dawn, that there's this gradual, that something that that you're going to get the best possible energy out of your day when you've had a solid night's sleep, right? And so when we live these lives where we're not quite resting enough, we're just going to kind of have metza mediocre energy. And so that's just kind of a way that we can make it real for ourselves in terms of thinking about yin and yang in our daily lives, is that we need to have really excellent yin to balance yang, so that yang doesn't get too out of balance, but also to have yang at all, to have it even be decent. It has to, we have to explore all aspects of who we are, and just sort of, and so where we go from there is so from the void comes the one, which is it, or something, and then that Shiva Shakti split, and then you get that's yin and yang, and then the birth from 2 we get 3. That's yin, yang, and Qi. And from the 3 comes the 10,000 things. So really everything else in the world of phenomena comes from this interplay of yin and yang in the form of Qi.
Now, there's another word that you use that I want to define before we go into all these branches and I pick your brain more, which was Taoism. How does that fit into this whole picture?
Well, we can trace Chinese medicine philosophy to a number of different sources, but really so several influences on Chinese medical thought come from Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And each of those, I am certainly not a scholar of all 3 of those thought traditions, but I have delved. I study with a Taoist teacher pretty regularly, or have for many years, and actually several Taoist teachers, as well as I am pretty familiar with Buddhism. But in any case, that the Taoists really, they were basically interested in the way of nature, and that this belief that everything that you can learn about the universe, you can learn by looking at any element of nature, because it's all ultimately within ourselves. And the Taoists were really into paradox. And so just this idea of that, so many people may be familiar with the Tao Te Ching, or the writings of Lao Tzu or Chuang-Tzu. Chuang-Tzu is probably the more appropriate pronunciation. But in any case, that this idea that of effortless action, wu wei, so the right thing at the right time, the right thing in the right moment, which arises from within. And so a lot of this, and really but one of the main metaphors for life is that of water. And so this idea of being really conserving your energy, conserving your qi by focusing inward, focusing on and letting right action arise by itself is kind of a key component of Taoism. And that idea that really what society is trying to put on you is not necessarily true. And so this idea of coming back to what is true for you, and that it's not very moralistic. It's not particularly concerned with right or wrong or good or bad, and it's not really about transcendence in the same way that some yogic paths, other than Tantra, can emphasize. So it's really immanent. It's really about it's all right here.
So Taoism is one of the many whether we want to call it a religion or a philosophy that influenced Chinese medicine as it was developing.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, and Taoism is certainly a religion, which is distinct from Chinese medicine. You don't have to you don't have to obviously adopt a particular religion to benefit from Chinese medicine, but it was certainly an influence. And so, just as Buddhist thought is an influence, and just as like technology is an influence in the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment are an influence on Western medicine, it's part of, you have to understand history to understand medicine.
Got it. Love it. Okay. So I think I'm ready now. I think we're ready. What are these 5 different branches of Chinese medicine? And I'm like eager beaver. The first one, right, is acupuncture. Well, I think that's the one that folks are the most familiar with. But I think people are often curious, like, why does acupuncture work the way it works, right? Like from the outside, it's, at least from my perspective, I always see like, oh, well, if someone massages my body vigorously, there's going to be an effect. But a teeny tiny needle, and of course I've had acupuncture done and I always love it and feel so relaxed, but I'm always fascinated and want to know more about like, why is this actually working when it seems like what's happening is so subtle and small?
Right. Well, so for your yogi listeners will be very familiar with this idea of the koshas, right? And so we have our physical body, we have our annamaya kosha, and then we have our energy body, right? We have our pranamaya kosha, this idea of an energy field that runs throughout our being, but also transcends the boundaries of our physical body, and that is just as real as the physical body. Or the for people who aren't yogis, when they first come into my office, I encourage them to stop thinking of themselves as a sack of meat and to start thinking of themselves as a living river of energy that's changing all the time. And that really, if we think about ourselves as mainly empty space, this idea, kind of the relativity idea that in physics, that we're pretty much at a molecular level or an atomic level, we're mainly empty space, and and the influences on that empty space, again with the koshas, there's the layer of the mind, there's the layer of wisdom and bliss, so if we think about Chinese medicine, you can use, I believe it's an energy-based medicine where the intention of the practitioner, the mind layer, and the energy cultivation of the practitioner all play into the ability to tap into these portals of consciousness called an acupoint to make a suggestion to the body that is quite specific. So these points on the surface of the body don't just exist on the surface of the body. They exist, they have internal pathways that don't show up on those meridian charts that you might have seen hanging on the wall. It's like that's a very small representation of all the pathways that there are. They connect deeply with our internal organs and can be used to regulate them. They can also be used to regulate aspects of our emotions and of our mental and consciousness, different aspects of our consciousness and our mental faculties. So really, and those are all kind of united and wrapped up together. So in other words, when you get acupuncture, if an acupuncturist can't just tell another acupuncturist, use these points and expect the same results. First of all, the person's going to be different when they show up next week than when they showed up last week in your office, that their energy might be totally different. But that in large part, how it works it starts with intention. And so it's in that sense, it does not really lend itself very well to the randomized double-blind study that is the gold standard, and in terms of medical efficacy. And yet at the same time, the mechanism of action for acupuncture, a lot of them have been identified. It does all this cool stuff. Like, we know it messes with the perception of pain via adenosine levels. We know it's very anti-inflammatory. We know that it helps the body regulate itself. So the same point could like increase stomach acid if you don't have enough, or decrease it if you have too much. It's like it just taps into the body's own self-regulatory systems. We know that it works on the same pathways internally as marijuana, the endocannabinoid system. We know that it has, so we can think about so we can speculate, okay, well, it's been shown that, for example, in Canada, it's a standard treatment for depression, even above medication, because depression is being conceived of as a disease of inflammation and not having much to do with serotonin. So we know that it does all this stuff, but we've yet to figure out a lot of how it does what it does. Like none of these explanations can explain why it can, turn a breech baby in utero, for example, or, like why it can do so we've identified all these sort of biomechanical or biochemical reasons why it does what it does, and none of them at all add up to the whole. So I feel like just from a scientific perspective, we are just starting to learn about, there's all kinds of like MRIs of the brain that happen, that show acupuncture's effect on the brain and on the nervous system. And there's all these different ways that people are trying to map it technologically, but we don't know. We don't know at all. The Chinese medicine version of it is that we use these points to help the body balance itself out. And it's the skillful application of understanding the energetics that makes it work.
So even if two people have the same condition, where you'd put your acupuncture needles might be completely different for each of them, depending on how qi is flowing in their body and your sense of them and who they are.
So we can think about that there might be 3 different people who all have digestive issues. Let's say all 3 of these people just have like gas and bloating and indigestion. And for one of those people, it might be that there is too much heat in the stomach. And for another person, it might be that the liver qi, the stress is impacting the digestion. And for a third person, it might be that they're eating way too many green smoothies and they're putting out their digestive fire. And so we need to support their spleen qi. So there might be a couple points there in common, but for the most part, it's the same condition that the people are coming in with, but 3 very different causes, which is why it's difficult to be like, well, what are the points for this? Or what are the herbs for this? It's like, well, we've got to think deeper than that. Everybody's got a different thing going on. And so when you come in for acupuncture, we're not just interested in talking to you about the thing that brought you in. We're also interested in the whole other suite of symptoms that might be presenting for you at that time that cross all sorts of different systems of the body, including what's going on in the mind and heart.
Okay, so I feel like we could go very, very deep here, and I want to make sure we cover the 5 branches first. So because I'm fascinated. And I know you're going to give us some practical tips for how we can, maybe self-diagnose is the wrong word, but how we can get a better sense of what's going on, even maybe with ourselves and our organs. So we'll loop back to that. But for now, branch 1, we have acupuncture. What are our other 4?
Well, branch 2 could be body work, right? So accessing the same points in the same pathways, which we call meridians, but using your hands instead of using needles. So that would be things like shiatsu and ama massage. Thai massage you could think about as being somewhat related to Chinese medicine. And it's a slightly different system, different pathways, but a lot of the pathways look very much like they came originally from traditional Chinese medicine. And actually, traditional Chinese medicine is a term that I like to avoid using because that was actually codified by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. And it's actually Chinese medicine could be classical Chinese medicine. It could be TCM or traditional Chinese medicine, but just know that there's multiple, just like in yoga, there's different schools, there's different traditions within this larger word that we consider. So there's acupuncture, there's body work. That would be the second one. The third one would be herbal medicine. And so we can use this idea of that every substance that you put into your body is either going to be heating or cooling, and that the idea that the 5 different tastes all have an effect on the body. And in Ayurveda, it's the same thing, right? Herbal medicine, it's a different 5 tastes, or it's 6 tastes actually. But in Chinese medicine, there's this idea that you can apply herbal medicine to fix imbalances in the body. And it's kind of like the take-home version of acupuncture. So if it's like for pain conditions, acupuncture is going to be a better tool, or body work. Also in body work, we use things like cupping and gua sha. So the application of these glass cups or plastic cups that suction up the fascia, it's a way of working with the tissue. That got a lot of good press during the Olympics, Michael Phelps and all the gymnasts that had these purple hickeys all over their backs and arms. That's from cupping. And so cupping and gua sha, which is scraping with a spoon, basically, are other forms of body work that come out of Chinese medicine. Wanted to loop back on those things. And then herbal medicine. And from there, we can think about herbs as basically strong food. So we can use diet as yet another branch of the medicine to help people either correct an imbalance or to stay in balance. And then Qi Gong.
I know. That's the one I'm really excited about because I think as someone who has a movement practice, and hopefully I think a lot of our listeners do too, whether they're doing yoga or meditation, Qigong seems like a very interesting branch or next step that we could take in exploring more of the Chinese tradition. So can you tell us what Qigong is and how it works?
Absolutely. So Qigong is like if you could imagine your entire yoga practice to be about the subtler flows of energy, you basically have Qigong. So it's actually it combines breath, movement, and intention. And so some Qigong could be done seated, some could be done standing or walking or even lying down. There's forms of Qigong that are strictly internal, that are just like inner gazing with manipulating the breath and meditating, like basically moving your energy around internally with your mind, with your intention. So that is so some forms of Qigong just look like meditation. Other forms of Qigong look a bit more like dance, like they're, Tai Chi is, for example, a form of Qigong where you're cultivating energy for the purposes of martial arts. Qigong originally just means energy exercise or energy cultivation or energy skill, which of course you can cultivate energy for the purpose of healing yourself or healing others. And that's going to be kind of the medical Qigong. And it was also used to cultivate spiritual skill and spiritual development. And so those latter two, the spirituality and self-healing and healing of others, are the kinds of Qigong that I teach and that I've practiced and have just tremendous respect for. There's, again, like yoga, there's a lot of different forms and styles that, so just like a restorative class is going to look really different than a power yoga, vinyasa class, which is going to look different than, an Iyengar practice. And so similarly with Qigong, there are going to be forms that are specifically medicine for the liver, forms that are specifically medicine for the heart, forms that calm the mind, because it's really about like, how are you playing with energy and where, and how are you cultivating it? It's like, I'm sure that you've met people who are quite advanced yoga practitioners, but they don't necessarily hold on to a lot of the prana that they cultivate, like that maybe they feel that it's like relaxing, but they don't necessarily feel like it's building resilience for them. And Qigong, it's like, it's very, very much focuses on bringing energy into your body from the outside world. And so it really is like practicing Qigong outside in a beautiful setting. You literally are exchanging energy with the natural environment and bringing it in to heal yourself.
I think that's really a critical difference between a lot of what we're maybe doing in our yoga practice and this Qigong modality, because I personally am very passionate and in love with Kundalini yoga right now. And a lot of what you were saying is a lot of the Kundalini Kriyas are very prescriptive in the same way that you were describing with maybe medicinal Qigong. Like, for example, there's a Kriya that's specifically for the liver or specifically for the kidneys. So that's very, very interesting. But ultimately, it's still about, raising your own Kundalini Shakti. And it's very much like an internal experience. And what I'm hearing you say with Qigong, especially whether you're practicing outside, is it seems like there's this additional element at play here where we're actually taking energy from nature, like you said, and bringing it into the body. Or can you tell us more about exactly how that works and how that ties back, if it does, to that yin-yang transformation extreme piece? Because that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. So essentially, it doesn't have to be more complicated than using your imagination. And at first, when I'm teaching a class, I will tell people, this is going to sound really hokey, like until it's real, like that a lot of times it's so I'll for example, in encouraging people to inhale and float their arms overhead and put their palms to the sky and imagine a connection between their favorite star in the sky or the sun or a constellation, the Big Dipper, like just to gather it up in a circular gathering motion with your arms overhead where you're literally imagining the stars connecting with your palms. And then gathering that and bringing that energy like you've got magnets in your hands, pulling it down the front of your body and depositing it in your lower dantian, which is the lower abdomen, or roughly the second chakra, about a hand's breadth below the navel and halfway between the spine and the front of the body. And I'll just have people get really good at that visualization. And then it's not imaginary anymore. Like the 10th time they've done that, they're like, oh yeah, I'm totally receiving something through the palms of my hands. And if I know that Yang Qi is about inspiration and the transformational energy and that the active, warming, transformative, productive energy of yang, then they're merging their mental intention with their physical movement, with their breath, and they're using acupoints. They're actually bringing it into a center in the body that is known, like the chakras, for a particular thing, right? And so that bending over and gathering energy from the earth and imagining that we use color, we use different colors that resonate. But a lot of times it's just understanding that, the yin energy, the cooling, the restful, the peaceful, the grounded, the supportive, the passive, the strength of our substance and our physicality, bringing that energy up from the earth and dragging it up the inner legs, or up the yin channels, that we're merging the earth's yin with our yin. We're recognizing that we are of the same elements of nature. We're resonating with those elements of nature, and we're reinforcing that with our mental intention.
This is definitely intriguing and making me want to try a class. For those of us at home, or for those of us who are just curious, what are some practical ways that we can just begin integrating some of the things you've talked about so far into our daily life, whether it's an awareness of yang, and I know you're going to talk about our yang addiction, or an awareness of qi, or an awareness of yin, or awareness of our energy at different times of the day, or that transformation point where we switch from one to the other. What are some just day-to-day things that we can start to be aware of?
Well, that feels like 4 questions to me. So a bunch of things come to mind. If you're wanting to increase your sense of qi and just playing with qi in your daily life, that spending time, well, first of all, assessing where does your energy go? Like if we do just divide our world in half into yin and yang, we can notice that our culture really overvalues yang. We're a culture that values what it looks like rather than what it feels like. We value the productivity and the busyness over the being and enjoying and the stillness. And I am so guilty of this. I am like a yang addict. And that, that addiction to doing, right? To like the creative, the expansive, that for me, it's like that idea of teaching and leading. It's like, this is very yang energy, as opposed to the energy of receiving and the energy of not doing and being, like, just that. So even just looking at how much of our lives are spent active versus resting, most of us are in a sleep deficit. Most of us are out of integrity with our own energy. And that a lot of times, if we look at why that is, for a lot of us, it's because we feel like we need to be doing more in order to be valuable, whether that's because we want to contribute to other people's lives and we're over serving, or whether we've got standards of perfectionism or a fear of failure, or something like a sense that we're not enough just as we are, that leads us to driving and striving beyond our energetic means. And so the people that show up in my practice a lot of times are people who are burned out and stressed out. And even though they have a practice, they still feel like they're rushing from thing to thing. And it's like, that's a cultural problem. That's not an individual problem. And so one of the things that I'm really passionate about is helping people wake up to the fact that we are a culture of yang addicts. And we look at things like coffee and caffeine and chocolate and even alcohol as a way of slowing down. It's like all these things that speed us up. And then it's like, okay, now I get to slow down. Oh, like I need to get heavy. And so there really is this kind of yin deficiency in our culture, where we don't honor the feminine, the intuitive, the rest, the enjoying having a body, the enjoying being, the enjoying sleep, letting ourselves feel tired, letting ourselves, do less than we're physically capable of. And it's at the same time, it's like we know that actually sets you up for pretty much every disease that there is. It's like when we start dipping into our reserves, like things start to break.
I definitely could not agree with you more. And I'm wondering what additional tips you have or we can give to people who want to slow down and who want to cultivate, I don't know if you'd call it like a more balanced state of qi, or even conserve some of their own qi while they're being forced or just required to operate in the yang world in which we live in. Do you have any ideas for us?
Several pieces of advice. One is that we know that change in Chinese medicine, we think about the 3 treasures, the Qi, the Jing, and the Shen. And the Jing is like that reserve energy, kind of analogous to Ojas for those of you in Ayurveda land. the Qi we've talked about, which is like prana, and the Shen is the consciousness. And so if we can think about change as happening at the level of consciousness, everything else will fall into place. So first of all, if you can recognize I'm a yang addict and admit you have a problem and admit why you have a problem. Like, what is it? What is it that I'm scared of giving up? Because really it's your identity that's threatened, which is not really who you are. That's not really true. It's just like how you've been able to survive in the world. It might have been adaptive at some point, but it's no longer adaptive if it's throwing you out of balance. And so really doing some self-study and looking at who do I think I am? And am I ready to part with that? And that requires some kind of the identity evolution is scary, and it requires some depth and holding a space for it. So having a practice where you practice letting go of who you are or who you think you are, really. So practicing that death of your identity, of your egoic identity. And you can do that with your meditation practice or your yoga practice, provided that it doesn't reinforce ego in that way. The world's simplest Qi Gong thing that I wanted to share, you can get that on my website. I have this calm and centered bundle, but basically this balancing yin and yang movement, which essentially is just starting with the feet shoulder width apart, knees soft, and you inhale and you bring your arms up over your head. And as you exhale, you just guide the hands down in the front of your body back to lower dantian. And then you inhale, you open the shoulders, you let the arms float up, you feel your feet on the floor, but you do that for a few minutes, and it will just start to slow you down. It will just start to bring the yang energy literally down and help you feel more connected to your lower body. When we get stressed out, our energy moves up. Our energy rises to the chest, rises to the head, it rises to the tight neck and shoulders. And for most of us, we need to bring it back down into the lower body, into lower dantian. And so that balancing yin and yang movement is a great way of kind of coming back into our center. And I recommend that people take that break a few times a day, and then to do a little Wu Wei spot check, which is that kind of right thing right now. And so before you rush off to do the next thing, making sure that you actually, first of all, want to do that's coming from a place of choice, and that that even if it's something you quote unquote have to do, that you're aligning with your sense of values before you do it, so that you are reinforcing to yourself your own power instead of your own victimization. And if there's plenty of things that you don't want to be doing at all, then that's the place to really start plugging the holes in your life. Is look at what you need to stop doing, because most of us are spread too thin. We're trying to do too many things. And so that idea of saying no to things, that idea of making sure that if you only have enough food or enough water for a few plants in your garden, making sure that you choose the right ones that you want to be cultivating and doing those really well, and really letting the rest die, because you can't, otherwise you'll be spreading yourself too thin.
I really resonate with so much of what you're saying, because I think for so many of us, myself included, our sense of self-worth is so tied up in how much we achieve and how much we get done each day. So this is such a practice to shift into our bigger, larger identity. And I think you've given us some really great tips. Before we let you go, I want to just make sure to quickly ask you to touch on the different organs in the body, because I think that's something when we start thinking about Chinese medicine, or people hear about Chinese medicine, it seems very organ-centric. And I know you've talked about how each of our organs kind of have their own special power. And I'd love to just hear an overview of them before we end our time together.
I like to introduce you to your internal organs with a capital letter. So thinking about your liver with a capital letter L instead of a lowercase letter L. And the difference being is that while your lowercase liver is this physical organ that is underneath your rib cage on the right side of the body, that's responsible for helping you detoxify and to digest your fat, that in Chinese medicine, it does those things, but it's also this bigger concept of liver energy. So if we look at looking at light through a prism, we can see all the different colors of the rainbow. similarly, if we refract Qi through that same prism, we can see the 5 elements. And so within the element of wood, we've got the liver gallbladder. And that is going to be, so liver gallbladder, because it's wood element, we think about the nature of wood. It grows upward and outward. It's responsible for things that like learning new stuff and being and growing, like literally physically growing, but also expanding your mind and being creative. So it's similar. So if you feel blocked in your growth, if you feel stagnant, it could be that your liver could use some help. And so being able to support your liver both in a physical way as well as an emotional way. The emotion that the liver is connected with is anger. And anger likewise moves you upward and outward. That's why we get angry, is when we feel threatened, vulnerable, or small. Anger moves us upward and outward. So it's connected with our liver chi. Similarly, upward and outward is where the energy goes when the liver chi stagnates in the gallbladder channel, which runs through the neck and shoulders and is responsible for things like migraine headaches. It's like too much yang rising in those channels. So there's going to be a taste, a smell, a color, a dimension of really every aspect of life that goes along with each of the internal organs. So just to go with liver for a moment, it's the season of spring because it's the rapid growth is like just after you're born. You're, like that youthful time of life. There's a lot going on. Springtime is new growth. It's that the color is green like unripe fruit. The taste is sour like unripe fruit. And so all of this resonates, and knowing a little bit about that, we know how to take care of ourselves in the spring, like to basically be nice to your liver, and also consider that which keeps the liver in check, which is the metal element or the lungs. So really we could go through this on every single organ, but basically, so that's the wood element. Fire element is going to be the heart and small intestine. And that's sort of the phase of manifestation. It's the emotion of joy. It's the circulation system, but it's also laughter. It's also the ability to be fully present and peaceful. Like the heart, we consider is the emotional center as well as the center of consciousness in Chinese medicine. And so then we can move over to the earth element. And also up in fire, we've got something called the pericardium and the sanjiao. I'm not going to get too much into that, but basically the pericardium is the heart protector. And it's a really important meridian and system to work with when there are emotional issues, anxiety, depression, etc. Earth element is that which makes us feel stable and grounded, and that comes from our food. So spleen and stomach are the captains of the digestive team, and they are about separating the pure from the turbid, digesting information, digesting our food, digesting our life experience, and letting that be nourishing to our systems without there being this residue or excess, like ama in Ayurveda, dampness in Chinese medicine. We've got the metal element, which is the lungs and large intestine, this husband and wife team that are responsible for taking in and letting go, right? As we take in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Large intestine lets go of the crap we no longer need, literally. And so that's the season of autumn. That's the time where the leaves are dropping off the trees and the sap is pulling inward for our next cycle of energy. So it really is about discernment of figuring out what we value and what we don't. Water element is kidney and bladder. It deals with the physical water of our bodies, but also has to do with the emotion of fear. It has to do with the reproductive system, housing our original purpose and our original sense of who we are. So a question of like, what is my purpose and what is my mission in life? That's going to be rooted in kidney energy and specifically in the Jing. And it has to do with our willpower or our ability to do our dharmic duty of like what we were put here on this earth to do. So that's like, I'm sure like I could talk about this for days, and I do in my Basics of Chinese Medicine course. If anyone is interested in a deeper dive, that's basically nobody's teaching this stuff to lay people. And so I just feel like there's so much richness in Chinese medicine that people can benefit from. And it's often really dumbed down or gets really jargony really quickly.
I know listening to you talk about each of the organs, it reminded me of how we talk about and focus so much on the chakras in the yoga system, right? That they each have a quality and an association and a color and a season, and there's just so much richness there. I think definitely whether people want to explore some additional courses with you or read some books or take a local Qi Gong class, there's just so much here that's ripe for exploration that I know I personally am really excited about. Do you have any resources you'd like to share with the listeners, whether it's a favorite book or, again, please tell us where they can find you and your programs if they want to just go deeper with all of this?
Yeah, if you're interested in doing Qigong with me online, I have a class called 12 Treasures Qigong, your movement multivitamin. And that is like, basically it's a 20-minute practice, and it's a really good intro if you're curious about the connection between the organs and the emotions and the physiological functions. I get into that a little bit. And it's rooted in a practice called 8 treasures, or 8 brocade, 8 pieces of brocade, which is over 1,000 years old. But I've added a few things that just for my body really work, especially things that open up the spine. And so it's a practice you can do in less than 20 minutes without getting sweaty, and that it's fully downloadable and available at brodiewelch.com. Another book that I really appreciate for Qigong is The Way of Qigong by Ken Cohen. And so, yeah, I really recommend that. In terms of Basics of Chinese Medicine is my online course. The next round launches October 18th. 2017. And that's basically if you want to learn how to apply the principles of Chinese medicine to your life, we go into the energetics of food, basic acupressure, essential oils that you can use on acupressure points, more into the 5 elements and how to figure out what type you are. You can actually go to my website, and I have a link to discover your Chinese element type with a little Quizlet that I have. You can just search for Chinese medicine quiz on my website. And the last thing is for people who are interested in the really deep dive of bringing Chinese medicine and yoga philosophy into their daily lives through basically creating the dinacharya of sages and yogis. I have a course called Level Up Your Life, and that we do a much deeper dive into it's habit change meets ancient wisdom. And it's basically more like, if you're interested in transformation rather than information, that's how I can help you with that. And that's basically a dynamic group that I run a few times a year that is basically where we talk about the energetics of life and how to align with it for less stress, more energy, and dial in the critical components of self-care that we all need in order to not only be healthy, but to develop into our deeper capacities as human beings.
Beautiful. Well, I'll make sure to link up your website and some of these specific resources right below the podcast so people can connect and get information from you. And I want to thank you again so much for coming on the show. I feel like we learned a lot. I know I learned a lot, but more than anything, I feel my mind is just more excited than ever to go deeper with a lot of this material. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise. And listeners, I would love to hear from you. What did you think of this week's episode? You can let me know in the form of an iTunes review, or of course you can join the conversation over on our private Facebook group. If you just go over to savannaheast.com/group, it'll redirect you. We can approve you as a member, and I would love to get connected with you. I hope you find some time today to cultivate this yin energy that we talked about. Step out of your busyness and your doingness and find some time for either yoga, meditation, or maybe even Qigong. Sending you so much love. I will talk to you next week from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah podcast.